Hello, Professor Chomsky.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And am I audible as well?
Good.
Can you hear me too?
Yeah, this is fine.
Great.
Got the closed captions.
Ah, right. Fine. So before we start, how long do we have, Professor Chomsky?
Well, let's aim for 45 minutes. How's
All
that?
right. All right. Well, let's get to it. So I have a couple of topics I would like to discuss, Professor Chomsky. First of all, the newest fad in education called ChatGPT and the future of education. Secondly, I would like to talk about critical pedagogy. Thirdly, I would like to talk about your newest book. And I would like to end with the pandemic or the end of the pandemic. So these are four topics I would like to discuss in these 45 minutes.
Okay.
So first of all, I really like your new haircut, Professor Chomsky, because it takes off 10 years.
My wife couldn't stand looking at me anymore. She insisted I wanted to look like Moses.
Well, you did, yeah. So she persuaded you to cut your hair. Well, it looks great. Thank you. So I was wondering how every day I see a new interview of you appearing on YouTube. You must be doing at least one interview a day. You have a really rigid interview schedule. So how many interviews and media appearances do you have on a yearly basis?
3 today. Varies. Talk. One was a talk, not an interview, but several hours a day usually.
Several hours every day, except Sunday, maybe.
Then there's classes, meetings, other things. It's pretty busy.
Yeah, I can imagine. So nice. Well, it's good to talk to you again. It's really good to have you on the show again. So I was wondering, at 94, still having this rigid interview schedule, what's your routine? How do you stay fit? Do you have a daily routine?
Not a routine that any doctor would approve of. Mostly sitting at the computer.
Really? Well, I know you have dogs, so you must be taking a walk every day.
Say the word, because they'll hear it.
All right.
If they hear it, they'll run for the door. You have to use paraphrases.
Yeah. So
right under my desk.
No special routines.
Go right under the desk as soon as there's an interview.
Yeah. So no special routines. No glass of wine at 1 o'clock, or I don't know, some gymnastics before you start your day. Nothing. It's genetic, I suppose. So, ChatGPT. I'm a teacher, and you know it's the fad of the day. ChatGPT. Children around the globe assign their homework to ChatGPT. They give a prompt, and they will say, "Please write a book report about I don't know." The withdrawal, which we're going to talk about later, and ChatGPT will generate a very nice book report. So what do you know about ChatGPT? Have you heard of this development of this latest fad in education?
Well, it's, I don't think it has anything to do with education except undermining it. ChatGPT is basically high-tech plagiarism. It's a system that accesses an astronomical amount of data and finds regularities, strings them together, looks more or less like what somebody could have written on this topic. Basically plagiarism, just happens to be high-tech. Well, plagiarism can be a nuisance. Teachers, I mean, as in the universities, for example, and departments where essays are required. For years, there have been programs that help professors detect plagiarized essays. Okay, now it's going to be more difficult because it's easier to plagiarize. But it's about the only contribution to education that I can think of, that it makes it harder to detect plagiarism. The systems have absolutely no value with regard to understanding anything about language or cognition. They tell you nothing about that any more than plagiarism does. And in fact, the more they improve, the greater their flaws, for a very simple reason. These are systems that do just as well for actual languages as they would do for impossible languages. So it's as if somebody produced a new version of the periodic table of the elements, which includes all the elements, all the possible elements, all the impossible elements, and doesn't make any distinction between them. It would be of absolutely no value to science or understanding. And that's basically what these systems are. They may have some value for something, it's not obvious what.
You were a university professor. How would you deal with these kinds of problems? Students using ChatGPT to generate reports and doing, homework.
Well, it wouldn't happen at, I mean, when I spent most of my life at MIT, it wouldn't happen there simply because the students wouldn't even think of doing it. They're interested in the topics, so they pursue the topics. A student learns nothing from this, of course, absolutely nothing. It's just a way of avoiding learning. And there are places where the way to deal with it is to make the educational program interesting enough so that students don't want to avoid it. This is a way of avoiding education. It's kind of like, I mean, there are colleges, I've talked to teachers who do it, who ban iPhones in class because the students will sit there, having a chat with somebody on their iPhone. Well, one way to deal with that is to ban iPhones.
Mhm.
Another way to do it is to make the class interesting enough so that nobody would think of it. And that's the challenge.
Well, doesn't this development, the fact that millions and millions of students are using ChatGPT to make their homework assessments and book reports, doesn't it tell you there is a huge pandemic going on in education? Boredom.
It's a sign that the educational system is failing. If students aren't interested, they'll find a way around it. I mean, we've all taken classes in which we had no interest, and you studied for the exam, got a good mark. 2 weeks later, you forgot what the course was about. Well, that's one form of education, not a very good one. And unfortunately, that's the form of education that's being driven forward under the contemporary neoliberal programs designed for efficiency, what's called efficiency, metrical results that you can put down somewhere, used to rate teachers in schools. It's a kind of education that was ridiculed during the Enlightenment. It was compared with pouring water into a vessel and letting some of it drip out, taking a test. Now it's considered the right way to do it. It's called teaching to test. Absolutely the worst form of education. And if you have a form of education which has no appeal to students, doesn't interest them, doesn't challenge them, doesn't make them want to learn, they'll find ways out. Maybe not come to class.
So ChatGPT is based on artificial intelligence, so it can have a great impact on the way we educate and the way we experience education. I know for a fact that Elon Musk is trying to connect the brain to computers. So how long will it take, do you think, before a company like Neuralink will be able to connect the brain to a computer and program, I don't know, parts of the brain so that we don't have to learn French anymore?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. That's science fiction. Almost nothing is known about the brain that allows us even to conceive of this. I mean, you can get to the point where you can detect neural signals, which might lead to an action being performed, like raising your hand, maybe at that level. But learning French, I wouldn't worry about it. Actually, we already have that. You don't need a Neuralink for it. Yeah, take your computer. I have a laptop computer sitting here. If I want to look up something in French, I just tap a couple keys and I get it. So
Yeah, nowadays Google Translate is fast enough to have a live conversation with a Frenchman, for example. You don't have to speak French anymore. I've experienced it.
not really. I mean, I use Google Translate, but you never trust what you see. It's a way of determining whether some article is worth reading. You get the gist of it, you can figure out what it's about. If you're really interested in understanding, you would never trust Google Translate or GPT, ChatGPT. That's if you want to get a general idea.
So
So
we
it's nothing. I mean, I have nothing against things that are useful. Like right now, I'm using live transcription. It's basically achieved the same way, brute force, but it's kind of useful. I mean, I don't actually trust it. If you look at it, you'll see plenty of errors, but it's much better. It's a fine assistance for someone who's hard of hearing, so that's good. It's like a visual aid if your eyesight is bad, or wearing glasses if you can't see.
So Neuralink is not going to be a threat to education anyway soon. AI, at least ChatGPT, is not going to be an improvement, at least not the way it is now. So if you have to guess what education looks like in 30 years, so we don't have a Neuralink to be afraid of. We don't, ChatGPT is not really going to be a threat. So what is education going to be like, do you think, in 30 years?
It's the choice of educators, planners, government officials, those who fund or usually defund education. They'll determine if education is not appealing to students, meeting their needs and concerns. There'll be all kinds of ways to avoid it. I'll tell you my own experience. When I went to college back in 1945, we had to take a course on chemistry, big lecture course. I mean, it was so boring. I couldn't stand it. So I never went to class, never. I had a friend who took pretty careful notes, and I used her notes to pass the exams. I never went to the lab, and I had the lab manual. It's obvious the way the lab experiments were going to turn out, so I just filled in the lab manual. They knew what I was up to because when I registered for the next term, I was charged for breakage at the lab. And I couldn't say, I don't even know where the lab is. But, that's the worst kind of education.
Yeah.
So the question of what the future of education, and of course I've took courses which I was very interested in. I would pay attention, work hard, try to learn what was going on. Well, that's what education ought to be,
Yeah.
cultivating those interests and concerns. If it fails to do so, students will do what I did in chemistry. Now they can do it with ChatGPT.
Yeah. It reminds me of the quote you always tell people, referring to a colleague who tells a student who asks, "What are we going to cover during class?" And your colleague says, "It doesn't matter what we are going to cover. It's about what you are going to discover." And I think many classes are far away from discovering anything. We're teaching to the test.
One of the world's leading physicists at MIT has talked to his freshman class. He was asked by freshmen, "What are we going to cover in this class?" He says, "It doesn't matter. It matters what you discover." And that's real education. But it's up to the teacher to make sure that that's the way it works. And if that fails, it's not necessarily the teacher's fault. So, for example, in the United States in the last 40 years, there's been a major effort to destroy the educational system, a lot of it just by defunding. So you go to a college now, they want to cut back on professors meeting with students. So you use adjuncts who are basically slave labor, you pay them nothing. Even graduate students pay them even less. A lot of administrators, they're run by business models. In the schools, in lower schools, a teacher may have 50 children. The problem is going to be keep them from killing each other. You're not going to teach anything. Well, those are and the programs for teaching, it's bipartisan. Under the Obama administration, the programs were basically teaching to test, as boring and stupid as possible, ensuring that nobody will ever learn anything except maybe some skills. Maybe they can maybe they can be skilled workers or something like that. But that's highly destructive of education, not just in the United States. In Britain, a couple of years ago, one of the major cultural critics, Stefan Collini, had an article in which he said that the Tory government is trying to turn first-class universities into third-class commercial enterprises by insisting that if you want to have a classics program at Oxford, you have to show that you can sell it on the market. Well, if you want to destroy the culture, that's the way to do it.
We know that the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos had a policy of privatizing education and defunding public schools. Now we have a Biden administration. How is he doing when it comes to education?
It's not the Trump administration was strict neoliberal. And their idea is education shouldn't exist, should just be private. This is quite explicit. So Milton Friedman, the economic guru of the Reagan administration, didn't believe that you should have public education. Everybody should be out on the market trying to survive somehow. And of course, it's a way to, you actually look at the history, it was a way to start it in the 70s as with Friedman's participation as a way to avoid integrating the schools. It was a way to get around the civil rights actions, which were attempting to integrate schools. And if white wealthy parents didn't want integrated schools, they would go to religious schools or other private schools and then expect to have public funding for it. Friedman was strongly in favor of that. In fact, he worked with segregationist groups to try to undermine the public education system. It's pretty ironic when you look at the history, because mass public education was a major US contribution to democracy functioning democracy in the late 19th, early 20th century. US was way in the lead. European countries came much later. Same at the college level. The land grant universities like MIT, for example, were an innovation in higher education that the European countries didn't come to till after the Second World War. This was a century earlier. Now the so-called libertarians, the neoliberal extremists, want to destroy all that. Betsy DeVos was quite frank about it. She said, yeah, Secretary of Education said we shouldn't have education. It should be just private. By now, it's even worse. The Supreme Court is now sort of kind of a hard right Catholic run Christian nationalists who think that the public ought to fund private education. They're breaking down the First Amendment state barrier between state and religion. So it's the duty of secular parents to fund religious schools. It's getting to that point. They're pretty frank about it. It's a Christian nationalist movement based on reactionary Catholic doctrines, not Pope Francis's church.
Let's stay in the field of education. I would like to talk about critical pedagogy. I think one of the goals of education should be to raise critical citizens capable of assessing power, assessing the state of democracy, assessing their own environment, and assessing the way they are living their own lives. And one of the books that really inspired me was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is the Dutch version, but you know his work. Have you ever met with Paulo Freire, by the way?
Well, here you can see what live transcription does. It says, have you ever met Battlefront?
No. Have you ever met Paulo?
Yeah, Paulo Freire. I know his work, but I never met him. Actually, I was his views were somewhat similar to John Dewey's in the United States, and that I knew pretty well. In fact, I went to a Deweyite school when I was a child up until high school. Very different, and it's based on similar ideas that pretty much what you said before, that the goal of education is to prepare young people to be able to participate effectively, constructively in a democratic society, not be tools at the hands of somebody else, which is what teaching to test is.
So I was wondering if it's possible in American schools to have a form of critical education, or is the system designed specifically to eliminate any criticism on the school system or politics or whatever? Is it possible to have a critical
Very
school?
live battle right now, very live. I think there are about 30 states, Republican states, states with Republican legislatures, which have passed one or another kind of law. They don't put it this way, but essentially to prevent the teaching of American history and to replace it with patriotic slogans. It's not put in those words, but the words, the way it's put is to ensure that children, meaning privileged white children, are not made to feel uncomfortable in class. Well, you read American history, you're going to feel uncomfortable. If not if you read patriotic slogans or listen to 4th of July orations. If you look at the actual history, you see plenty to be uncomfortable about. You should find out what kind of society we have, why it's this way, where did it come from. You should know all those things if you want to participate in a democratic society. If you want to just follow orders, never ask questions, then yeah, let's not teach American history or society or anything else. The fuss about critical race theory is pretty much like that. A lot of furor about critical race theory. Almost nobody knows what it is. In fact, the leading spokesman for pressing on banning it, Christopher Rufo, Manhattan Institute, right-wing institute, he said very clearly, by critical race theory, we just mean a cover term for a lot of things we don't like. You know? So it doesn't matter what's this arcane field of legal analysis really is, but the idea is to try to prevent students from having an education, from coming to understand what kind of world we live in, what kind of society we have, its achievements, its injustices, what should be dealt with, what are the problems we have to face, shouldn't do that. And to be precise, to be honest, it's not just the right wing. You can learn a lot about this by looking at the publications that came out in the early 1970s, a very important period, because in the 1960s, there was a wave of popular activism, student activism, women's activism, others. It was a period in which lots of challenges to authority, doctrine, racism, sexism, all sorts of issues came on the agenda. That scared the pants off the establishment. Across the spectrum, at the right, there was a very harsh reaction. At the what's called the left, it was more interesting. So one document I've recommended since it appeared in 1975 and I've used many times is a book called The Crisis of Democracy. Very much worth reading. It's from the liberal internationalist element in international society, liberal internationalists in United States, Europe, and Japan. You get the complexion of it from the fact that the Carter administration was drawn almost completely from their ranks, Trilateral Commission. And what's the crisis of democracy? That there's too much democracy. The 1960s, they say too many sectors of the population became engaged in the political arena, pressing for their rights and interests. That's no good. They don't say it, but what's implicit is it's only the privileged and the powerful, folks like us, we should run things. The rest of you go away and shut up. And what they called for is more moderation in democracy. So go home, be passive and acquiescent, and we'll take care of things. Actually, that is liberal democratic theory, if you look at it. I've written a lot about it. What do they say about the universities? That's interesting. They say the universities are failing in their task of indoctrination of the young. Indoctrination of the young. That's the task of the universities, and they're failing. That's why you have these kids out on the street opposing the war in Vietnam, calling for human rights, civil rights, women's rights, and so on. We don't want all that stuff. So go back to indoctrination of the young. This is the left of the spectrum. It's much harsher on the right, but it's across the spectrum, you know, and you see it in the policies that follow. They take various forms, but basically improving the indoctrination of the young. That's the left liberal position.
What happens if we don't teach children about critical race theory, about the slavery, the past? What happens when we don't teach kids about, social emotional learning and woke? all subjects and topics that were a threat to Ron DeSantis, who banned dozens of books in the state of Florida. What happens when we don't teach children about the true past of the American nation, for example? What happens?
If you don't teach them, of course, if you don't teach them and they don't learn by themselves, they won't understand why things are the way they are. Why is there such an enormous gap, say, in wealth between Black families and white families? Huge gap. Why? You don't teach them the reasons, it'll engender racism. Must be something wrong with them. You know, they're lazy, they have the wrong genes or something. So if you want a racist society, it's the way to do it. If you teach them what the real answers are, what happened for 400 years, you get a different society. Same with Native Americans. Why are they stuck away in those reservations? Because they're no good at anything? Or is it because they had a rich, lively civilization which was destroyed by genocidal invaders? Which is it? Well, you want to understand the way the world is, where privilege and wealth came from, what are the injustices in our current society. You have to know something about this. And therefore, it's important, if you want to preserve privilege, means not just privilege, but white privilege. You have to make sure to suppress what actually happened. And same with women's rights or anything else. Why are these women parading around and demanding all sorts of things? Why don't they go back and take care of children and the kitchen where they're supposed to be? As the Nazis insisted, that's where the women's belong. Raise children and take care of the family. We'll take care of the rest. It's kind of society you want. Don't teach what happened. Don't teach what happened. Don't teach the fact that for the founding fathers, women were not persons. Literally, they were property. The founding fathers, of course, took over English common law, Blackstone, in which a woman is the property of her father, handed over to the husband, property of the husband. But one of the arguments against women giving women the rights to vote, was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because an unmarried man would have 2 votes, himself and his property. Worth knowing that lasted in the laws until 1975. 1975, the Supreme Court finally ruled that women had the right to serve on federal juries, meaning their peers. So technically, they're then persons. You go back to the second phase of the Constitution, the amendments after the Civil War excluded women. They were not persons. Well, is it worth knowing that? I think so, if you want to understand the society. But if you want to make sure you don't understand it, then bar the schools from teaching it.
I think,
and the way you do it is by concocting fairy tales about how the woke movement is trying to turn children into sex slaves. Or in fact, I think forget the percentage, I think maybe half or so of the Republican Party think that Democrats are run by pedophiles who are trying to groom children. And that's good propaganda. And it's a way of enraging parents, getting them to try to organize to stop the schools from destroying their children, you know.
Talking about critical education, I think this book will never be talked about in education. Let's move on to your newest book. I think it's the newest one, or have you published another one recently?
Coming. It's one of
It's,
the reasons.
yeah. So this book, The Withdrawal, is about U.S. Imperialism, wars. It says Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, but it covers Vietnam and Laos as well, actually, in the book. And the book ends with Vijay Prashad reminiscing about his contacts with you over the past 30 years. But there is no chapter in which you talk about Vijay. So I was wondering, who is Vijay and what does he mean to you? What do you admire at him, about him?
He's done fantastic work, more than a good deal more than anyone else. He's been the historian and advocate for the poor majority of the world, the global South, poor in the United States. There's nobody comparable. I mean, both his scholarly work, which is excellent, but just his activism. We're constantly on interviews together. He's always in some other part of the third world, traveling around constantly working on the problems that they face. His Tricontinental Institute is at the forefront of dealing with the basic problems of the large majority of the world, who are barred and excluded from our concerns and considerations. I just saw that I read an article just today which pointed out that you're going to have more impact on the leadership to deal with global warming because of the decline of ski slopes in Switzerland, than because hundreds of millions of poor people are starving in the third world. It's pretty accurate. You will have an effect at the Davos conference. They're worried about the ski slopes. In fact, I can see it right where I live. There was a drought in the Southwest. I live in Arizona. Plenty of green golf courses around. There's a concern, the right wing is concerned that if you put up too many solar panels, it'll take up too much land. So it's a big problem. Well, there was an article studied England. Turned out that the amount of land used for golf courses is, I think, about 5 times as much as used for solar panels. You got to have your priorities correct.
I'm mindful of the time, so let's talk about it shortly. First of all, why did you decide to co-author a book with Vijay on this topic?
Well, we've been in contact for many years, and there is a striking confluence of collapses of the imperial measures of this century. The subtitle gives the illustration. It seemed a good time to try to write about the shape of the world order that's developing. And in fact, if we were to do a second edition right now, or maybe an update, we might refer to articles that are in the newspapers right today, say reporting from Davos. Very interesting. You can find one, I think it's in Politico today, talking about how the mood is, Davos is the masters of the universe, as they call themselves, the rich and powerful of the world. It says the mood has shifted. It's from what we were describing, withdrawal and decline, to the new rise of US power and admiration for US power, because it's really showing its muscle again. We're now showing that the US is showing, yeah, we can really dominate and rule the world, so you better respect us. It's not that we're declining. And very excited about this major change that's taking place. We can go back to the good old days when the US could run things just by force and violence. Of course, that's not the terminology they use, but that's what it amounts to.
So you also talk about Russia and Ukraine, but of course, this was written, I think, early in the year. So there was not a lot of information available, but certainly when there's a second edition, you are going to include that chapter as well, I suppose.
Well, Putin's invasion of Ukraine gave a real shot in the arm to US power. It was a major gift to the United States in many ways. The United States is benefiting enormously from the war. One, just militarily, small. I mean, Russia is the one military adversary of the United States. And with a small, tiny percentage of the US military budget, the United States is able to destroy a large part of the Russian military using Ukrainian bodies, but it's a side point. So that's a real bargain for the, and beyond that, in geopolitical terms, Putin's invasion drove Europe deep into the pockets of the United States, to the detriment of Europe. Europe's declining, suffering, but the United States is benefiting enormously. And now you have to remember that through the whole Cold War, since the end of the Second World War, there's been a conflict over the nature and future of Europe. Europe has a huge population, advanced economy, advanced culture, and so on. Should it be an independent force in world affairs? That's the Gaullist vision. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, Olaf Palme, others said, yes, Europe should be an independent third force, not subordinate to the United States. There's a conflicting vision. Europe should be subordinate to the United States. That's the Atlanticist vision, meaning under NATO, which is run by the US, of course. It became a significant issue in 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev proposed an expanded version of the Gaullist conception, what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, independent economic trading bloc moving towards some kind of social democracy. That's the Gorbachev vision. Well, that was alive. Putin's killed it. Not only was the invasion criminal, but it was also completely stupid from the Russian point of view. He's handed the United States its fondest gift on a silver platter, namely Europe subordinate to the United States, no independent force, we run things. Well, that's part of the major change that's taking place. There's another aspect to it, though. The world doesn't go along with this. You read US propaganda, it seems we're fighting a great moral leadership, doing wonderful things. The world doesn't see it that way. Almost the entire global South says none of our business. If you Europeans want to fight each other, go ahead. But don't hand us this tale about humanitarianism and democracy. We've been at the wrong end of the guns for hundreds of years. We know what you're up to. You don't believe anything about humanitarianism or law or democracy or any of that. It's our hundreds of years of experience. So cut the hypocrisy. You want to have a proxy war with Russia, with Ukraine, go ahead, but it's not our business. If you look at sanctions, almost nobody participates. It's just Europe and the English-speaking countries in Japan. The rest of the world doesn't participate. And in fact, what they're doing is one of the effects of the war and the sanctions is to lead to the development of independent financial systems. So India, its trade with Russia can be in rubles. Its trade with China in renminbi, in Chinese currency. Interesting development with the oil producers, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They're moving towards independence from US control. One of the strength of the dollar for 50 years, 60 years has been that it's a petrodollar. Dollar payments for oil are in dollars. Saudi Arabia, UAE have accepted that. Not any longer. They're starting to develop independent relations with China. It's called a petro yuan, and it's an independent financial system. Europe has been strangled by the US financial controls. So, for example, when the US pulled out of the joint arrangements with Europe and Iran on the Iranian nuclear programs, the US pulled out and then imposed sanctions on Iran to punish Iran for the fact that the US had pulled out of the agreement. Europe was strongly opposed. They wanted to maintain trade and investment in Iran. Can't do it. US sanctions are third-party sanctions. If you violate US sanctions, you get thrown out of the international financial system, just run out of New York. Well, Europe went along with that, but for how long? Most of the world isn't going along with it anymore. There's a good deal of lying about this in the Western press. You have to be pretty careful. So there's a lot of euphoria in the Western press a couple months ago when Prime Minister Modi of India expressed his opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was published all over the place. And what actually happened is there was a meeting in Samarkand with Modi and Putin, and Modi started his comments by saying, "War is not the way." That was highlighted all over the place. India is separating itself from Russia, a great, wonderful thing. Well, take the trouble of one of the nice things about the internet is you can look things up. So you can look up the Indian government website and see what Modi actually said. He did say war is not the way. And then he went on with practically a love letter to Putin, saying our relations have never been closer. We're going to work together to get a better world. We're on the same side of everything and so on. All of that was cut out of Western commentary, just the first few words. Well, it's pretty much the same when the Russians sent a delegation to the conference in Indonesia, the international conference in Bali. They were welcomed. Lavrov, foreign minister, went, and others welcomed in Africa. It's not the world that the United States sees. Propaganda here is very careful that you see only a particular picture of the world, which power systems want you to see. The world is actually quite different. Again, the advantage of the internet is if you want to, you can look up foreign sources. You get a very, not Europe, but you get a very different picture.
So the news has been dominated by the Russian invasion. It's all we talk about in the Netherlands as well. And the pandemic has gone to the background. So if we take a look at the United States, has the pandemic finished? Is it over?
Pandemic is raging in the United States. The United States has one of the world's worst records in dealing with the pandemic. It's kind of interesting to look at the coverage. It's China that's condemned for its treatment of the pandemic. Yes. Actually, China, the number of, up until recently, the total number of deaths in China is about maybe what you get in a week in the United States. They've saved millions of lives, but we don't talk about that. What we talk about is the fact that the current, right now, there is a problem in China as the people are released from the controlled system, which saved millions of lives, and there hasn't been adequate preparation for giving enough vaccination and so on. Maybe they'll take care of it, maybe not, but their record up till now is incomparably better than the United States. By comparative standards, they would have saved the equivalent of several million lives. But China never gets any credit for that, of course, because you have to show that they're bad. Incidentally, speaking of the Netherlands, it's not just the Ukraine war. The US war against China is having a very harmful effect on the Netherlands. Biden has virtually declared war on China. That's the way it's described in the business press. The United States must use its economic power to prevent China from developing. How? By blocking advanced technology like semiconductors. US can use its power and control to prevent Chinese development. It's that's considered wonderful in the United States. Yes, we have to do that. Our task is that we don't try to outdo China by doing better ourselves. We outdo China by preventing them from developing. That's considered very praiseworthy. Well, where's the Netherlands fit in? Netherlands happens to be one of the main producer, in fact, of high quality materials for semiconductors. And the US is banning the Netherlands from sending them to China, not allowing China to use anything that has American components in it. And of course, the way supply chains work, everything has an American component in it, maybe a patent or something that may harm the Netherlands very seriously if the Netherlands goes along with US orders. As far as I know, it hasn't been decided yet. Japan is also under the same pressures. They've been finding ways around it. Also South Korea, Samsung is under those pressures. So the United States is trying to coerce its allies into declining economically to support the US war to prevent China from developing. That's a major fact in world affairs. How will the Netherlands react? Be interesting to see. How will Germany react when it's being deindustrialized? Germany had a very the world's most successful industrial system, a complex system ranging from Netherlands to Slovakia. It's all collapsing. Are they going to accept to be deindustrialized as part of the US effort to dominate the world? It's a big question for Europe, Netherlands in particular, but that's off the topic. It's not the pandemic.
Well, exactly. So I was wondering, you say the pandemic is still raging in the United States, but and yet I believe all the measures have been lifted. When you look around you, you don't see masks anymore. You don't have to keep 3 feet distance. So how can you say there is still a pandemic going on while all these measurements and restrictions are lifted?
The efforts to deal with it have declined. And that's very serious. Not just the fact that people walk around without masks. The funding has declined. You want to get a booster shot now, you got to pay for it. It's not given with, very low pay anymore. Worse than that, research has been cut back severely. I mean, the vaccines were made available very quickly and effectively because of a lot of funding of research. That's been withdrawn. Every scientist knows there's going to be more pandemics, and we're not preparing for them because funding for the kind of research that might lead to more effective vaccines, maybe even a universal vaccine. That's been sharply cut back. So we're planning to ensure that there'll be much more damage from coming pandemics. But that's common to Western US policy across the board. There's also much more serious than the pandemic is the crisis of heating the atmosphere, baking the planet, much more serious. That's being cut back, in fact, going into reverse. Of course, subsidies to fossil fuel companies continue, but new fields are being opened for exploration, a lot of planning for long-term investment, euphoria in fossil fuel headquarters. The profits are going through the roof, and great opportunities for long-term development investment to destroy the world as quickly as possible, which is what's happening. So this is capitalism run berserk, going berserk. I mean, capitalism is based on the principle that Adam Smith called the vile maxim: all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else, and don't care what the effects are. That's capitalism. It can be controlled. It's been somewhat controlled in past years. Now it's let free, and it means we destroy ourselves. Take a look at, say, the region where fossil fuels are being produced, the Eastern Mediterranean region. Take a look at the scientific projections by Israeli, other regional scientists. They're predicting that by the end of the century, temperatures will have risen 5 degrees Celsius, and the sea level will have risen 2 to 2.5 meters. Of the densely populated areas along the sea. What's that going to be? Go a little bit north to Cyprus, and there's a war brewing between Turkey and Greece. Serious kind of war. What's it about? Pipelines and exploiting the resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. So let's see how we can kill ourselves faster. Pandemic is serious. This is much more serious. I mean, the political leadership of the world is on a race to see how we can destroy ourselves as quickly as possible. Actually, one of the few sane voices now is the UN Secretary General, Guterres. You might want to read his talk a couple of days ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, pleading, have a little bit of sanity. Nobody listens. Much better to make more money tomorrow, and who the hell cares what happens? Well, that's the world we're living in. Capitalism gone insane.
I have one last question, Professor Chomsky, because I want to be respectful of your time. You have so many fans around the globe, but since last year, you have lost a couple of fans because, well, there appeared a video on Twitter in which you talk about the unvaccinated, and some people blame you for saying that the unvaccinated should isolate themselves from society in order to keep the harmful safe. And now that was in 2021. We're in 2022 now. I was wondering, do you still have the same opinion when it comes to the unvaccinated? Because many of my followers have been asking that question.
I say exactly what I said then. The unvaccinated people are perfectly free to refuse vaccination. Shouldn't be forced on them. But then they have a responsibility to act as decent human beings. If others want to protect themselves, they should honor that right. If a hospital, for example, or a restaurant or a meat packing plant or whatever imposes restrictions saying, please don't come in here if you're not vaccinated or masked. The unvaccinated have a responsibility to honor that. In that regard, they should isolate themselves. Unless you regard the unvaccinated as some privileged caste who have the right to do anything, harm people if they feel like it, well, you have to, I think you should agree with this. So it's the same position I had then.
Well, because some people might say there's a lot of research by now, and research will say that even the vaccinated are still capable of transmitting a virus to another person, and people still can get ill.
They certainly have a right to believe that if they like. But if, say, a hospital decides to follow the advice of 100% of medical journals around the world, 100% of professional societies around the world, and impose a vaccination constraint, they have a right to do it. They don't have the need to follow your opinion. You can have your opinion, but they're entitled to say, we're going to follow the advice of the scientific community almost universally. We have a right to do that. You don't like it, too bad. You don't want to put on a mask, go somewhere else. I think that's quite proper. It's as if somebody said, look, if you look at the statistics, there aren't very many deaths from people who go through red lights. You know, probably almost none. So why should I stop at a red light? It's an infringement on my freedom. Well, not the kind of society I would like to live in.
Well, a hospital is, of course, an easy example because there are many fragile people in a hospital in danger of being infected. What about schools or a playground?
Take a restaurant. Suppose people in a restaurant, workers in a restaurant, and people who go to the restaurant want to be free from infection. So they have a masking requirement. I think that should be honored. Take a meat packing plant where men are working together, men and women are working together under hideous conditions right next to each other. There are meat packing plants which have imposed masking and vaccination requirements. I think they should be honored. You can say, I don't believe that I'm infectious. Okay, you're fair to not believe it, but not to endanger others.
Because many people consider you a freedom fighter. You know, you protect or you try to advocate for minorities, and then it causes some kind of cognitive dissonance. Chomsky almost, you know, Chomsky not respecting this small minority that doesn't want to be vaccinated. And we've been reading about you for so many years.
They can refuse to be vaccinated. Anyone's free to refuse.
Yeah.
But you should have the decency to allow others to protect themselves, like following traffic laws.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do believe in freedom from arbitrary, illegitimate authority, but I obey traffic laws. I don't think that's illegitimate.
Yeah, the thing is, it appears to some that that the unvaccinated shouldn't be taking part in society, almost, because
they can be all over society, but they should not. They should observe requirements by groups that want to follow the advice of, in fact, 100% of medical, basic medical authorities, and say, this is the way I want to protect themselves. I don't think the unvaccinated are a privileged caste.
Yeah. I think that's a really reasonable point of view, Professor Chomsky, and it doesn't stop me, this point of view, from respecting you for all the work you have done. So you didn't lose me there. I was just obliged to ask this question for my followers. So I would like to end this interview again because it's the third time you joined my show. Thanks a lot for doing that. And what's your next book? When is your next book coming out?
Next book?
You're not right. You're not working on anything right now.
Yeah. Another collection of interviews and articles with follow-up from the book called The Precipice.
Yeah.
That's probably the next one. Also some technical work coming out. But
On language. Well, anyway, Professor Chomsky, thanks a lot for your time. You've been really generous. And well, I would like to thank you for all the work you've done and for inspiring me and all my readers and viewers. And I hope to read many more books and to see many more of your videos and presentations. So, Professor Chomsky, thanks a lot once again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
thank you.
Bye-bye.